trace of spirit made of smoke and fire. There was also no association with the jinn, even though one did feature early on in Final Fantasy III as an antagonist who cursed the citizens of Sasane and Kazis. The small horns that adorn the skull of the Ifriti in Dungeons and Dragons were elongated, extended behind Ifrit's skull, and it wore sandals with strapping on the lower leg. The concept art from which this was based was drawn by Yoshitaka Amano. It showed Ifrit with a mustard-coloured body, black hair and brown horns, but the in-game representation was a mixture, as Ifrit had 3 different colour palettes to represent the 3 possible moves. Each had black hair, but the healing Ifrit had a green body with brown horns, the weaker offensive Ifrit had a whitish blue body and red horns, and the most powerful Ifrit had the mustard body with green horns. Final Fantasy IV served as Ifrit's introduction to Western audiences, but it condensed various aspects of the original appearance. Known as Jinn owing to a mistranslation, Ifrit was a horned beast with green skin and brown horns, but unlike the previous game, Ifrit now had purple hair as opposed to black hair. With summon magic isolated to only one individual, Rydia, the number of potential moves was reduced, and this saw Ifrit's healing and single target attacks removed. Hellfire was the move that remained, as did its application as a fire-based attack that damaged all targets, but in the Western version, this move was known as Jinn, again owing to a mistranslation. Based on damage output, Ifrit remained a mid-level spell, but the method of acquisition changed, as instead of being bought in a shop, Ifrit was made available to Rydia automatically when she rejoined the party as an adult, and this also made Ifrit a mandatory summon. In Final Fantasy V, Ifrit continued the visual trend, with the same colour configuration and clothes, but this time Ifrit stood taller, with its arms by its head and legs almost crossed, not unlike the stereotypical pose for a genie or djinn. Ifrit was also given a role to play in the story, and in this regard, it could be found in the Library of the Ancients and then fought as a mandatory boss battle. During this encounter, Ifrit attacked with fire magic, but also used kicks, and displayed a weakness to ice attacks. Once defeated, Ifrit became a level 2 summon, and due to this being part of the story, acquisition was again mandatory. In addition to Ifrit's small role in the story, should the party have acquired the summon prior to encountering Ramuh in a random battle outside the town of Istory, then should Ifrit be used at the start of the battle without taking any other action beforehand, Ramuh would throw in the towel and lend his power automatically due to respect. When called upon in battle, Hellfire remained as the signature attack. This again dealt fire damage to all opposing foes, making Ifrit useful against fire-weak enemies, including Byblos, the final boss of the Library of the Ancients. But in relation to the other available summons, Ifrit was low tier by the end of the game, and this served as something of a regression in terms of Ifrit's combat prowess. Final Fantasy VI saw a huge expansion to the concept of summons, both in terms of the number available for players to call upon and their role within the story. In this regard, in addition to the previously established canon with Ramuh, Ifrit was also connected with Shiva. After venturing deep inside the Magitech research facility, the party learnt about the horrible experimentation that had been taking place on Espers. Discarded by Kefka, Ifrit and Shiva fought against the party as they were desperate to try and escape, but after sensing Ramuh, they stood down. During this fight, Ifrit would use variants of fire magic and displayed a near identical appearance from what had been seen within Final Fantasy IV and V. It was only after the fight, as Ifrit was acquired as a mandatory Esper, that we would see a slight deviation. This could again be chalked up to a mistranslation, but in the SNES and PlayStation versions of Final Fantasy VI, Ifrit no longer performed Hellfire when summoned. Instead, even though the move was still fire-based and would still damage all enemies, it was called Inferno by the localization team. As Final Fantasy ventured onto the PlayStation, many hallmarks were retained, but there was also some room for creative interpretation, and in this regard, we got to see a whole new side to Ifrit. Some aspects of the original concept resurfaced, such as the mustard-coloured body and brown horns, but the purple hair introduced in Final Fantasy IV was used instead of black hair from the original. Even though it may have been planned at some point, summons had their roles reduced within this particular story, as they were distilled into materia, and this allowed for a new method of acquisition, as instead of being purchased, learnt or fought against, Ifrit could just be found on the floor of the cargo ship after defeating Genova Birth. When called upon, Ifrit would use Hellfire, a move that still dealt fire damage to all enemies, but Ifrit was again one of the weakest summons available. And this aspect, as well as all of its visual elements, was then retained when Ifrit reappeared as a summon in Before Crisis. Final Fantasy Tactics represented something of a detour for the franchise, as Yasumi Matsuno and Hiroyuki Ito attempted to create something that was similar, but also quite unique. Ifrit appeared as one of the available summons, but unlike Final Fantasy III or V, where summons could be used after purchasing or defeating them, in Final Fantasy Tactics, summons could be learnt by leveling up and spending these subsequent job points. And in this regard, Ifrit was one of the first and therefore one of the weakest summons available. Working along with the theme of creating something similar that was also unique, Ifrit was still a horned beast, but it saw the first appearance of a brown body. Ifrit also had brown hair, something that had not been seen before, but it did retain the standard brown horns that had been there since the beginning. Ifrit's combat application was also amended. There was still the standard association with fire, but we saw a new move called Infernal Blaze, which instead of damaging a single target or all targets, now affected a specific area of the map. Ifrit next appeared as a guardian force in Final Fantasy VIII, and this, for many, represents one of the quintessential appearances. Sticking with the brown body that had just been introduced in Final Fantasy Tactics, the design team mixed things up by introducing black horns and fiery hair. Ifrit was also given wrist guards and earrings to make up for the removal of clothing elsewhere. In relation to the story, Ifrit was encountered inside the fire cavern as part of a training exercise. This mirrored Final Fantasy V and VI, where Ifrit would need to be fought as part of the story and then acquired as a mandatory guardian force. This took place right at the start of the game as a precursor to the seed examination, and Ifrit would make note if Shiva had already been acquired, building upon the narrative connection between the two summons. When used, Ifrit returned to the standard application, as Hellfire would rain down fire elemental damage to every enemy, but due to its early acquisition, Ifrit was once again one of the weakest GFs available. Despite Final Fantasy IX serving as a tribute to everything that had come before, Ifrit had one of the most distinctive designs to date. It continued with the new theme of having a brown body, but it also featured brown hair, and we saw the first appearance of orange horns. Outside of that, Ifrit's physique was quite different, adopting a less humanoid appearance with accentuated forearms and a very defined top, which would typically be found on quadrupedal mammals. Final Fantasy IX also introduced a new method of acquisition. After the party returned from the outer continent, Garnet could learn Ifrit from the Topaz gemstone, which was received as a gift from Dr. Tot. But technically, Ifrit was auto-learnt as well, as Garnet already had the Eidolon within her. When called upon, true to form, Ifrit would scorch with a fire-based attack that would deal damage to all enemies, but there was again a deviation, as the English localization team chose to call the move Flames of Hell as opposed to the traditional Hellfire. By the time Final Fantasy X was in development, Square had created a multi-team development system. This meant that large parts of the team who worked on Final Fantasy VIII also worked on Final Fantasy X, and it led to Ifrit adopting a very similar aesthetic, but it wasn't identical, as Ifrit now had ankle guards and a necklace. Due to the expanded role of summons, which required more focus on combat application, Ifrit was granted a new move called Meteor Strike. This was a non-elemental attack that bypassed Protect, and it was joined by the classic finisher, Hellfire. With these elements combined, even though Ifrit was still one of the weakest Aeons available, it was a reprisal of what we had seen in Final Fantasy III, where Ifrit could perform multiple moves. We also saw an interesting evolution. Often, Ifrit was only fought in relation to the party proving their worthiness to wield its power, but in Final Fantasy X, even though Ifrit was given to Yuna, following her completion of Kilika Temple, there were still multiple fights against the Aeon via proxy, with some mandatory and some optional. It was also the first appearance of Dark Ifrit, who could be found at the entrance to Home in Bikanal Desert. When Ifrit then appeared in Final Fantasy X-2, there was no evolution, and for narrative reasons, Ifrit's role was diminished in significant fashion, with the Aeon only appearing as a boss at the end of Chapter 3. Ifrit next appeared in an unlikely source, an anime produced by Gonzo on behalf of Square. This was called Final Fantasy Unlimited, and perhaps due to the nature of the medium, it saw radical changes made to Ifrit's appearance. Ifrit now had a flaming body, complete with flaming horns and flaming hair, and even though Ifrit did not perform a named move when summoned, there was still a very clear association with fire, and the summon's legacy was retained. The next chronological appearance of Ifrit came in Final Fantasy XI. Acting as the first MMO in the franchise, Final Fantasy XI saw numerous details fleshed out in comparison to what had been seen with previous iterations, and in this regard, summons saw massive benefit. Instead of being pawns who were mere gameplay devices, summons were now integrated into the story, and Ifrit was one of the 6 sleeping gods who resided in proto-crystals that were scattered throughout Vana'diel. This piece of narrative exposition saw Ifrit related to Ramu and Shiva once again, something that had not happened since Final Fantasy VI, and it was through these proto-crystals that the power of the elemental gods housed within could be harnessed, but not without fighting first. In the case of Ifrit, Ifrit Prime would need to be defeated as part of the Trial by Fire questline, and upon doing so, summoners would gain access to a powerful ally. And that was because, unlike almost every prior iteration, Ifrit wasn't just part of the proverbial furniture. Instead, it was one of the strongest summons available, capable of dealing massive amounts of damage, especially to enemies who were weak against fire. To assist with this damage dealing, this version of Ifrit had the most expansive list of moves to date, but in an interesting twist, Hellfire was not one of them. Instead, this iteration of Ifrit made reference to Inferno, a move previously only seen in Final Fantasy III, if we're talking the appearance in Final Fantasy VI up to a mistranslation, and Meteor Strike, which had been introduced in Final Fantasy X and was now Ifrit's strongest move. The other moves were a rather rudimentary punch, some high-level fire spells, and 2 new additions called Burning Strike and Flaming Crush. Due to the nature of the experience, some of these moves only affected a single target, but much like in Final Fantasy Tactics, the more expansive moves would only target an area as opposed to guaranteeing damage against all enemies. What was also intriguing about this iteration of Ifrit was the design. Its body was brown at its core, and it also had black horns, but layered over the top were fiery red scales acting as a type of armor. All of these traits, alongside the addition of the ability to fight against Ifrit as either a group or solo via trial-sized Trial by Fire, made this particular iteration quite comprehensive. But what followed afterwards was a period of experimentation for Ifrit, as appearances deviated from what had been established, or just served as subtle odes. It would have been easy for Ifrit's appearance in Final Fantasy Tactics Advance to serve as a continuation to what had been seen in Tactics. And in many regards, it was. But from a visual perspective, the developers chose to add something of a flourish. Ifrit still featured a brown body and brown hair, and its appearance as a horned beast was retained. Ifrit was adorned with a full coat of golden armor and had hooves complete with woolly legs. Unlike every prior game, in Tactics Advance, Ifrit could be summoned upon equipping a weapon, and in this case it was the Guard Staff. Once enough AP had been accumulated, Ifrit would then be mastered and could be summoned without equipping the staff, even when using another job. Nonetheless, Ifrit was of decent strength and was mid-tier in terms of performance, something that had not been the case since Final Fantasy IV. This particular iteration of Ifrit was then carried through to many of the properties that spawned from Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, including Final Fantasy Tactics A2, the Crystal Defenders, and Final Fantasy Tactics S. But when it came to the release of Final Fantasy...
Женское дело какое терпеть. Детей рожать не женское дело, какое терпеть. Представляешь, я бы не был на свете, понимаешь? А еще хуже, ты был бы один закормленный такой, да. Или когда у тебя куча братьев и сестер, да, и на тебя особо времени нету, и ты тоже не ходишь. Да, ну да. Видишь, да, понял, да. Да, понимаю. Да. что-то надо говорить о России. Да, благородная, благодетельная. Вот это и есть надо самое. Ну да. Наверное, летом так и советую. Ну, получается, что граната ты говоришь, понял, да. Да наоборот, потому что да. Ну наоборот, да, вот это он имеет в виду. А, ну наоборот, да. Нужен ему просто. Ну наоборот, да. Ну наоборот, я говорю. Я себе говорю, да. Ну ладно.
Fancy 12, even though it was also part of Evelician law, Ifrit did not appear, at least in the traditional sense. This represented a first, as up until this point in the franchise, even though there had been a few exceptions, such as Mystic Quest and earlier iterations of the Saga and Mana franchises, after Final Fantasy III, Ifrit had featured in every single Final Fantasy release and had done so as a summoned beast. Final Fantasy
Время – деньги. Но когда нужны деньги, не обязательно тратить на это время.
Final Fantasy XII broke this tradition by relegating the traditional Final Fantasy summons to references, and in this regard, Ifrit appeared alongside Shiva and Leviathan as airships that were part of the 8th Fleet. It would have been assumed, based on there being no Ifrit present in Final Fantasy XII, that its sequel would follow suit, but Ifrit appeared in Revenant Wings amongst an abundance of Espers. But even though Ifrit had appeared in numerous Ivalice games prior to Revenant Wings, there was no reference to what had come before. Ifrit was now covered in crimson red fur and had more in common with a Yeti than the feral beast we'd come to expect. This iteration was also unique, as it represented the first appearance of a black body and white horns. Ifrit could be bought using the new Orosight system, and it was classified as a rank 3 fire-type melee summon. This made Ifrit a high-tier Esper that could cause significant damage through the use of Burning Strike, a move previously only seen in Final Fantasy XI, and its special attack, Hellfire. There was also a nice bonus added here, as even though Hellfire was an area of effect move, it also affected targets with slow. Throughout the game, Ifrit could also be fought multiple times as a boss, a nice reference back to Final Fantasy X, where acquisition did not depend on victory in a skirmish. Ifrit also had its first official connection with the Jinn, if we're chalking up Final Fantasy IV as an error, as Jinn appeared as a weaker variant of the fire-type summon, and they fought alongside Ifrit in numerous missions. Ifrit next appeared in Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII. This was an interesting iteration, because even though before Crisis had taken direct inspiration from what had appeared in Final Fantasy VII, the development team working on Crisis Core saw fit to ignore what had come before and create a brand new Ifrit. It saw the mustard-coloured body replaced with a standard brown body and fiery hair instead of purple hair. This Ifrit also had a pronounced hop, as seen in Final Fantasy IX, and to coincide with this, we saw Who's return, something that had been introduced in Tactics Advance. Wrist guards were also visible, as in Final Fantasy VIII and X, but to take it one step further, this particular Ifrit featured small pieces of armour on its shoulders and across its chest. Throughout Crisis Core, Ifrit could be fought against numerous times. The first encounter came at the behest of Genesis, and the second came via a mission called Rematch with Ifrit. And it was upon completion of this second mission that Ifrit would be made available, and when summoned, Ifrit would use Hellfire as its DMW attack, but its power was dependent on the level of the attack. When being fought against, Ifrit could also use a second move called Flame Shot, which hadn't ever been seen before. It represented an interesting twist, and the notion of producing creative interpretations of Ifrit did not slow down. Even though Ifrit had been established in the original version of Final Fantasy IV, for the remake there were wholesale changes, at least from a visual perspective. Ifrit now featured a fiery body, complete with accompanying horns and hair. We had only ever seen this before in Final Fantasy Unlimited, and I'd like to think that in some small way the developers were inspired by the anime. Everything else was a direct reference to the original. Ifrit was auto-learnt and mandatory, and when called upon would perform Hellfire, a strong move that classified Ifrit as a mid-tier summon. Final Fantasy IV The After Years then made reference to Ifrit from both the original SNES version of Final Fantasy IV and the DS version, depending on which version you chose to play. Every other trait was kept intact, but there were some slight tweaks made. Ifrit could now only be acquired after being bested in combat, and it also appeared as an unbeatable boss in the context of the story, and in this regard, it also meant that you could fight Ifrit multiple times. Ifrit next surfaced in Dissidia Final Fantasy, a game that pulled from various sources to celebrate the franchise. It saw the past of Ifrit celebrated too, with Final Fantasy IV Ifrit being called upon when doing a manual summon, and Final Fantasy X Ifrit called upon when doing an automatic summon. It was then much the same in its sequel, Duodecim, but owing to the inclusion of Yuna, Ifrit from Final Fantasy X also made an appearance, and it could make use of Meteor Strike and Hellfire, just like in the original game. For the next numbered Final Fantasy, Ifrit was again kept on the sidelines, as Final Fantasy XIII only featured a loose reference. Ifrit appeared during the Prompta Sancta event, where it served as an eidolon of the pulseless seed that was attempting to destroy Cocoon. As part of this story, Ifrit squared off against Ramuh, who was representing a cocoonless seed, and this served as a nice ode to previous games where the pair had a connection. From a visual perspective, it was similar to what had been seen within Final Fantasy VIII and X, with a brown body and fiery hair, but the horns were now metallic, with fire literally coming out of the tops. Ifrit's next appearance also served as a nice ode, but it was a much more comprehensive one, as the team who worked on Final Fantasy Dimensions had previously worked on The After Years. It meant Ifrit had a similar visual design, although its body was made brown this time. Ifrit would need to be fought and defeated in the Cave of Perfervidity in order to be acquired, and during this fight, and when used as a summon after, Ifrit would make use of Hellfire, which displayed in standard application. But Ifrit also had a new move in the boss battle. This was called Heat Up, and made Ifrit stronger and faster, and allowed it to use Hellfire. The next major iteration of Ifrit came in Final Fantasy XIV, and just like the previous MMO, Ifrit was again ingrained into the game's lore. This time, Ifrit was the primal worshipped by the Amaljar beast tribe, and they planned to use its savagery to defend themselves against the Garlean Empire. As part of this process, the tribe would kidnap individuals so that they could be tempered by Ifrit and turned into worshippers. Owing to their fanaticism, they attempted to summon Ifrit multiple times, but it was defeated each and every time. Perhaps because of its association with the Amaljar, Ifrit was given a more lizard-like appearance in this particular game and adopted the fiery colour scheme, similar to what had been seen within the Final Fantasy IV remake, but with much more detail. Ifrit could be fought various times in the Bowl of Embers, and with each increase in difficulty, the breadth of actions taken by Ifrit was increased. Amongst the selection were numerous odes back to Final Fantasy XI, such as Inferno, Meteor Strike, Burning Strike, and Flaming Crush. This iteration also introduced plenty of new moves such as Eruption, Crimson Cyclone, Incinerate, and Infernal Nails, which was particularly harsh if the summoned nail was not destroyed. Some of these moves could then be used when summoning Ifrit to aid in battle, but even though Hellfire was used by Ifrit when appearing as an antagonist, this particular move was not used under instruction from the player. Inferno was instead installed as its most powerful move. Nonetheless, when looking at all of the elements combined, alongside Final Fantasy X and XI, this was one of the most comprehensive iterations of Ifrit to date. Final Fantasy Type 0 continued a common trend, as even though there was no chronological association with Crisis Core, the two games were worked on by the same team, and the model used in both games was near identical, perhaps to speed up production. But that was where the similarities stopped, as this particular iteration of Ifrit was one of, if not the most expansive we had ever seen in the franchise. Within the context of the game's story, Ifrit was associated with the Dominion of Rubrum, and was often used to help repel invasions from rival factions. But what made this particular iteration of Ifrit so comprehensive was that Ifrit was no longer a singular entity. Instead, Ifrit was a class of Eidolon, and each variant of Ifrit had a different name, as well as different abilities. The most common moves were Eruption, which had just been introduced in Final Fantasy XIV, Meteor Strike, and a new move called Blazing Strike. This could be used by Ifrit, Firebrand, Rubicante, and Vulcan, But Calamity was quite different, as due to its specialism as a close-quarters brawler variant, it could only use a move called Flaming Fist. The Ignis variant was then the opposite, unable to fight close range, but devastating at long range due to its use of Meteor Mash, an upgrade of Meteor Strike, and Hellfire. Each of these summons was given to the player after completing a specific objective or speaking to a certain individual, and they all had strengths and weaknesses, such as innate regen, longer summon times, and berserk status. But even though there were so many different variants, no version of Ifrit was ever fought, a very uncommon occurrence. Final Fantasy Explorers arrived a few years later, and Ifrit was one of the 12 summons available for players to call upon. Also known as the Fire Djinn, Ifrit could be fought as a boss 2 times, and could be used by the player if encased in Magicite. Across the various fights, and when summoned, Ifrit had access to Hellfire, but also used Flaming Fist, which had just been introduced in Type 0, and 2 new moves, Fiery Advance and Conflagrant Wall. Ifrit also built upon the visual design of Final Fantasy 8 and 10, returning to a beast-like appearance with brown body and fiery hair, but with much more in the way of armor plating. This iteration of Ifrit was then resurfaced for Final Fantasy Explorers Force, but a similar approach was not adopted for the follow-up to Final Fantasy Dimensions. Final Fantasy Dimensions 2 arrived a few years after the original game, and although there were some similarities, it was very much its own experience. Due to creative liberties afforded to the development staff, this saw Ifrit take on a rather different form, as instead of being a horned beast, Ifrit was a horned humanoid with white hair and a fiery tail.
Сбермаркет — это качество. Продукты привезут свежими, а если не устроит товар, просто вернут деньги. А я считаю, что Сбермаркет — это выгода. Наценок нет, регулярные скидки есть. Сбермаркет — это комфорт. Удобное приложение и быстрая доставка 20 минут. Давайте заказывать уже. Качество, выгода, скорость. Все в Сбермаркете.
Есть комплимент от заведения, а есть для заведения.
Откройте счет для бизнеса на rife.ru и получайте бонусы по карте MasterCard.
In this form, Ifrit appeared as a story boss inside the Ifritia mines, but also appeared during boss-specific events. And when fought and summoned, Ifrit would use Hellfire and other standard fire spells. Dimensions 2 also featured numerous variants of Ifrit. Dark Ifrit we'd seen before, but there was also Neo Ifrit and God Ifrit, which was more traditional in appearance, albeit with way more horns. Each had their quirks and introduced some new traits. Dark Ifrit, for example, could use a brand new move called Evil Hellfire. This